Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Industrial actions galore are what the United Kingdom has been witnessing for over a year now, from teachers to journalists to civil servants to bus drivers and so many others. It almost appears that no profession has been spared in the UK of poor working conditions and are not having a livable wage. And today, junior doctors have joined in by going on strike until Saturday. Will the government be able to pacify these professionals, or will the situation simply continue to deteriorate? Well, stay with us on this spotlight as we will be taking a look at the latest situation in the UK. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. Out of London, Limbit Opik, former member of the British Parliament. And out of Bristol, Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Thank you both for being with us. Good to see both of you. Well, let me start off in London. And Limbit, why have we seen so many industrial actions in Britain since last year?
It's about money. Let's not pretend it's about anything else. The inflation rate in this country has skyrocketed compared to where it has been, and wage rates have not skyrocketed. To put it quite simply, people feel that they are becoming worse off. This is in a first world country, the sixth largest economy in the world. But to take the example that you described, the junior doctors, they want a 35% pay rise because they say that their income has not kept pace with inflation. So what you're seeing here is a rolling program of independently organized industrial actions, but which collectively mean we are essentially living in an ongoing general strike. That's damaging for the economy. It's certainly damaging for people's health. And it's quite damaging for the credibility of the United Kingdom because it begins to look like the government, a conservative government, which always in the past has claimed to be a friend of industry, has lost control of industrial relations.
Well, what does it all mean, Tony? I mean, with the junior doctors going on strike, it is said that up to 350,000 medical appointments may be canceled during the next 4 days. But despite all of this, the majority of the public actually support these strikes. So what's your assessment of that? What does it mean?
Well, it's certainly not anything like a general strike. I think we'd know about it if it was. And it's important to note that there's been beginnings anyway of a settlement with many of the NHS workers already, with in mid-March a deal of 5%, which is well below the roughly 11–12% inflation rates and 17% food inflation. And they're also, it looks like, going to get about a £1,500 extra amount as well. So they'll have to renegotiate next year, which is kicking the can down the road to a certain extent. But we've got a major problem with the National Health Service. And the biggest problem is the Conservative Party seem to want to get rid of it, abolish it, and bring in a US-style insurance system. It's worth noting how the National Health Service started. It really started in the ruins of the Second World War. And people had spent those years of being bombed in Britain by the Nazi bombers in the Blitz, pulling people out of buildings. And of course, you didn't really want to ask, have you got health insurance before treating them? At the end of the war, I think people understood in England and all across Britain that we needed to have a better system to deal with this, and that really the government's responsibility was to bring in a system which delivered health care across the nation at cost. And really, it's been a glowing example to the world, because if you look at the actual costs of doing the National Health Service here in the UK, which is basically a National Health Service insurance system, which nobody pays for at the point of delivery, but everyone pays a little bit in tax equally across the country, it's been a great leveler. And in fact, it's really boosted the country's survivability rate. In other words, people have been living longer and longer because they have no problem just picking up the phone and getting a doctor. But the trouble is, since the Conservatives arrived, that's become more and more difficult. And it's quite obvious if you look at the Conservative Party, Oliver Letwin back in 1988 and again in 2004, he was penning documents which were designed to privatise this. In other words, to sell it off to the usual suspects, the hedge funds, and the private equity firms to buy up the health system. And of course, this is a terrible way to go, and it will actually, I think, make healthcare overall far more expensive, like it is in the United States. So that's why the doctors are fighting back, because they've seen not just that their pay has gone down, but that many health workers have just left the profession and that they're struggling to keep up. We've now got 7.3, I think you mentioned the figure, 7.3 million people in Britain waiting for operations. That's 1 in 10 people now, because the doctors simply aren't there anymore to do the operations. And they're trying to basically save the system by saying, look, you've got to pay us properly, and then more people will come into the profession and we can respect this job once again. Because, of course, they believe, as many people in the country believe, the Conservatives just want to destroy the National Health Service on principle. They don't like the idea of free anything, especially free healthcare, that everyone should have to pay for it like they do in the United States and elsewhere.
Well, Limbit, what about that? I mean, because the government is saying really that they cannot afford, for example, NHS in the form that it is now. I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, the specific answer to your specific question is that if we cannot afford a free system of health or a very inexpensive system of health at the point of delivering the service, then we are abandoning exactly what my colleague has just correctly said, something which is pretty close to sacred in this country, an 80-year-old system of health, which has unquestionably improved the quality of life of the least wealthy the most, and improved the life expectancy for just about everybody. Now, there's a general point here as well. The United Kingdom has made some catastrophic mistakes in terms of its economy. We don't need to go through the details unless you want to. But essentially, we've bankrupted ourselves, and that's because of diabolically bad decisions by politicians. Now, I was an MP for 13 years, and I hold my head in my hands when I look at some of the stupid decisions which have been made in the last few years. Now, you're right, technically it's not a general strike, but what seems to be happening is that independent groups of workers have all come to the same conclusion, which is that they are all losing a standard of living. Let me put all that together in a simple sentence. What it means is that if you live in the United Kingdom and you're not super wealthy, your standard of living is going down. And the government doesn't really have a solution to that. We could all work harder, I suppose, but they're actually trying to increase tax rather than reduce it. With soaring energy prices and, as you just heard, really high food inflation, it does look to me like we've got problems in the health service that we have to find a way to afford. And the people who are culpable, the people who are guilty of the fact that we haven't got enough money, are the very decision makers who, by implication, are indeed trying to privatize aspects of our health service.
Well, Tony, on the one hand, the British government says it really cannot afford, for example, NHS in the form that it is now, and also giving other professionals the wage increase that they want. But on the other hand, we have seen the UK promise £6 billion to Ukraine. What is it? Is it that the British people is not the priority for the British government? Or what's your assessment of this?
Well, yeah, as Lembit was saying, there's been terrific mismanagement. What we've seen, for example, is billions and billions upon billions, almost, almost as much as it takes, poured into these projects like Ukraine, but also the furlough scheme that was running here during the COVID. These sorts of things, they pour as much money as they wish into. What's happening is that, of course, that there are a certain amount of selectivity. It seems a bit arbitrary, doesn't it, as what we can afford and what we can't afford. And that's exactly what's going on. There's arbitrary decisions which are based around ideology. Ideology, really, all you need to do is to look at our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, never elected to be Prime Minister by anybody, not even by the Conservative Party, actually, to be Prime Minister. He then sort of took over. People didn't really want him at all. But he's from the City of London. The City of London looks after the interests of shareholders. It doesn't look after the interests of ordinary people. And what he's been doing is he's been turning it into an operation which is funneling money towards shareholders rather than anywhere else. So yes, there's no problem whatsoever with that. But I think we need to look at companies like Goldman Sachs, which is where Rishi Sunak used to work. Over in France, we have Macron from NM Rothschild and Sons. We've got a whole coterie now in the West of leaders who are actually ex-merchant bankers, we used to call call them, before the days of Thatcher. These people now who have been into big money, and the people don't really seem to have much of a connection with Rishi Sunak. He's somebody that represents a completely different class to normal people. So I think we need to absolutely return to some kind of mixed economy. Look at the situation where Britain was in the 1960s, where we had, and 70s, where we had most of our infrastructure managed openly and controlled by the central government. That means the rest of the economy can get on, and they're only paying at cost for things like healthcare, telecoms, electricity, gas, water. These basic infrastructure it should all be, I think, renationalised. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party would have done probably something like that. But your basic question about do we have the money? Well, what's happening is Britain is being plunged into what they call a classic debt trap. A debt trap is where you simply cannot repay the debt, and so the government doesn't have, every year has less and less and less money to spend, and the big corporations have got the whip hand. So the government's really now put itself on the back foot, and Rishi Sunak is there doing public relations speeches saying everything's going to be fine with the health service, making positive speeches, but actually he knows that we're in such an amount of debt we'd probably never be able to pay it back. And that's the way that big business likes it, because then industry is in control of the policy. Government is simply reacting to what the big companies want. And so I don't honestly think that, I mean, of course, they could start to make up money and spend it on the things that would be good for the infrastructure of the country, and simply let some of these big banks, I'm afraid, go bust, as they should have done back in 2008. You know, we should have seen the realistic situation happen to those banks. In any other business, if you bankrupt, you go bust. You don't get bailed out by the government. But that's what the government did. And I think
well, let me get Limbit back in on this conversation. Stay with me, Tony. I mean, Limbit, the UK's national minimum wage is £10.42. Can people really live on this? I mean, are they able to pay their basic necessities there with this type of salary?
There's a film called Bread and Roses, and the message is we want bread and roses too. You can afford the bread, but not the roses. All the frills have disappeared for many of the least wealthy in this country. No one's really going to starve, but you can go cold because heating is incredibly expensive. And that is a great question you've asked, but it has a very dark answer. In reality, some of what we would consider to be necessities are beginning to become unaffordable, especially for the elderly with small pensions. If you consider the fact that, as Tony rightly said, the government has now got an unaffordable debt and a ridiculously high inflation rate and very high interest rates of its own doing, it actually means that they are impotent to help the people that need it the most. The other irony I'm thinking about from what Tony said is Rishi Sunak wanted to appeal to the wealthy and to the entrepreneurs, and he hasn't even succeeded in doing that. So putting all that together in answer to your question, we have a serious, serious problem in this country where the necessities are beginning to become unaffordable. And if we have a cold winter, that is literally going to kill people in 6 months' time.
Well, Tony, you heard Limbit talking about that no one is starving, basically. Statistics show, though, over 13 million Brits right now are struggling to eat, and 9.3 million of these are adults. 4 million are children. That's a staggering amount. Unbelievable. In a country which is one of the richest in the world. I mean, how do they get away with it? I'm amazed, Tony, that we haven't seen more protests, more complaints by the British people. I mean, tell me about that side of things.
Well, I think we're not like the French. The French tend to go out on the streets and build barricades and set fire to things when they're impoverished. The Brits, I'm afraid, are a bit more stoic. We put up with much more. Right. Probably we shouldn't. And also, I think, our democratic system is flawed and our press is flawed because really, I mean, I speak to you as a former BBC journalist and I look at the coverage that we're now getting in the UK and I don't see any real investigative journalism going on in this country at all about the real solutions to these problems, which lie in a system of basically taking control of the financial system in the country. We need to have a government that's prepared and a treasury that's prepared to move on these banksters, you know, the people who've got away for years without going to jail, for example, fixing the LIBOR rates, committing fraud, this kind of thing. So that's what I would
let me
like
just jump
to
in
see.
here, Tony, with what you're saying. But if you have a government whose individuals involved in it really represent that same 1%, or it's very difficult, don't you think, for any legislation to come about? Because do you not think it's like they're part of the whole? You're talking about as far as dealing with the banks, but when we look at even Sunak and his background and so many others, I mean, it's sort of interrelated. I mean, your assessment, what do you think?
Well, look, you know, what they've done is commit suicide, really, financial suicide by upping interest rates. This is, look, they've said, right, this is what they've said, is that we need to put up interest rates to stop inflation. Well, of course, it's had the opposite effect. I don't know if anyone, you know, is supposed to believe this. What we've seen is massive inflation, of course, which kicked all this off in energy prices, which was deliberate. This was really done by the oil industry itself and by the government policies to do with Russia partly, but largely by industry itself. And we know, don't we, that if you put up fuel prices, all the other prices will, because, you know, everything has to be transported around, right, goods and services. And so this has had the opposite effect. And upping interest rates has just simply made things worse. So I think we've got, you know, the British government have really lost control of their financial policy. And unless there's some moves to actually take back for the Treasury to take back these sorts of controls over the city, things are only going to get worse here. And that's, I think, where much of our, we did have a movement back about 10-15 years ago of people occupying the City of London and taking the fight to the big institutions in the city. And I think that's where we need to go if we're going to do anything about the increased cost of living. Otherwise, it's just going to carry on getting worse. And as Lembit said, we're going to have a cold winter.
Lembit, your take. What is it going to take to change this situation around?
Fear in politicians about one thing, that they won't get re-elected. And here's the problem. As Tony has implied, Jeremy Corbyn really did want to do it differently. And I have enormous respect for him because he's ideologically consistent. Sadly, we now have a Labour Party, which is like the Conservatives, and a Conservative Party, which is like the Labour Party. There isn't really a choice anymore. And as a result of that, the difficulty we have is that essentially the public don't have a credible alternative voice. After we finish this interview, I'm going to be joining a group called the Together Association, who are looking for the best politicians in all the parties, not just one party, to try to change the situation, if you like, to wag the dog of politics and put the public, who at the end of the day are meant to be served by the politicians, not just be beholden to them, back in control. The other thing that Tony said, and you inferred as well, was about the situation in Britain. I don't think anyone is starving, but they are malnourished. Millions of people now depend on food banks, and let's not pretend that that's anything to be proud of in this country. So people are cold, or they will be cold next winter. They are malnourished, and they're losing hope. How on earth has the sixth biggest economy in the world got here when we've got a party which has always claimed to be the party of business? My prediction is it is going to get worse before it gets better, because I think Tony and I agree the government's lost control. I actually studied economics at the University of Bristol, funnily enough. I stopped studying it when I realized it was a pseudoscience and politicians didn't understand it anyway. Now we see it played out writ large with a high interest rate, which of course increases inflation too. It's going to be a long, cold, dark summer, let alone winter.
All right. Well, thank you both for being with us here on the Spotlight. Lembit Opik, former member of British Parliament out of London, Tony Gosselin, investigative journalist out of Bristol. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew. Hope to see you right here next time.